Alexander is sitting on a riverbank in India, thousands of miles from home. Behind him, burned cities, broken kingdoms, more land than any human being had ever controlled in the history of the world. In front of him, nothing left to conquer, and he is crying. He is the most powerful man who has ever lived, and he is sitting on the ground, crying like a child, over something almost nobody could guess. His own generals do not know what to do. Nobody has ever seen him like this before. So what could break a man that nothing else in the world had ever been able to touch? Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why he broke down that day. And you might understand something about yourself too. To understand that moment, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before Alexander conquered anything, he was raised inside a competition he never agreed to enter. His father, Philip, had already built the strongest army in Greece, and he made sure his son always knew exactly how big those shoes were. His mother, Olympias, told a completely different story. She told Alexander that his real father was not Philip at all. She told him his real father was Zeus, king of the gods. Picture growing up with that. Two parents, two competing stories, and one shared lesson taught over and over without either parent meaning to teach it directly. Your worth is not something you already have. It is something you have to go out and win. That idea plants a seed, and it is a more common seed than people think. A lot of us grow up learning, without anyone saying it out loud, that love and attention only really show up once we have achieved something worth noticing. For Alexander, that seed grew into an entire empire. At just 13 years old, there was a horse in his father's stables that nobody could ride. Bucephalus would rear up and throw off every single rider who came near him. Everyone assumed the horse was simply wild, untamable, dangerous. Alexander noticed something nobody else had bothered to notice. The horse was not wild. The horse was scared. It kept panicking at the sight of its own shadow, stretching out on the ground in front of it. So Alexander did something simple. He turned the horse to face the sun, so the shadow disappeared behind it. Then he climbed on and rode him without a single fight. His father watched the whole thing in silence, and when it was over, he said something to his son that would end up shaping the rest of Alexander's life. He told him, "Seek a bigger kingdom. Macedon is too small for you." One sentence, handed to a 13-year-old boy, became the operating instructions for the rest of his life. Macedon was never actually too small. Alexander was just told, at 13 years old, that nowhere on earth would ever be big enough. That hunger for proof followed him everywhere, and it shows up clearly in two very different stories. The first happened in a city called Gordium. Legends said there was an ancient knot tied there, so complicated that nobody had ever managed to undo it. And there was a prophecy attached to it. Whoever untied the Gordian knot would go on to rule all of Asia. Most people who tried studied it, pulled at it patiently, thread by thread. Alexander looked at it for a moment, and then simply drew his sword and cut it in half. Problem solved. Prophecy claimed. It is a great story, but notice what it actually reveals. Alexander did not have the patience to sit with a problem he could not immediately dominate. He needed the win, and he needed it fast, and he needed everyone watching to see him take it. Now compare that to a strange meeting he had with a philosopher named Diogenes. Diogenes lived in a barrel, owned almost nothing, and famously did not care what anyone, including kings, thought of him. When Alexander finally traveled to meet this man everyone talked about, he found him lying in the sun and offered him anything he wanted, any gift, any favor, just name it. Diogenes looked up at the most powerful man in the world and said one thing: "You are blocking my sunlight, please move." Alexander was reportedly stunned into silence. He later told his own men that if he were not Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. Sit with that for a second. The most successful conqueror on earth, looking at a man with nothing and openly wishing he had the one thing that man actually possessed: peace with himself. That is the real story about validation. Alexander spent his entire life needing the world to confirm that he mattered. Diogenes needed absolutely nothing from anyone, and Alexander could see it and envied it, and still could not stop chasing the exact opposite. There is an idea from psychology that fits this perfectly. The psychologist Carl Jung talked about the mask people build when the real version of themselves feels too fragile or too human to show the world. It works like armor, built to protect something more fragile underneath. And the danger of wearing armor that heavy for that long is that eventually you forget there is a real person still underneath it. As Alexander pushed deeper into Persia, he started requiring people to bow down and touch their heads to the ground in front of him, the same way Persian subjects bowed to their own god kings. His own Macedonian generals, men who had fought next to him since they were boys, refused outright. One of them, a man named Cletus, had literally saved Alexander's life years earlier in battle, cutting down an enemy blade that was already swinging at his king's head. At a drunken dinner years later, Cletus made the mistake of saying, out loud, that Philip's victories mattered too, not just his son's. Alexander grabbed a spear and killed him on the spot. The god king could survive being defeated by no army on earth. He could not survive one old friend in front of a room full of people, reminding him that he was still just a man. He killed the one person honest enough to tell him the truth. By then, Alexander believed the mask more than he believed his own oldest friend. Now let us talk about fear, because most versions of this story get it wrong. They treat Alexander's fearlessness like some kind of gift he was simply born with. It was not a gift, it was a discipline, and it is worth separating what he actually understood about fear from what the legend just assumes he understood. At the Battle of Gaugamela, heavily outnumbered, maybe 5-1, by the full might of the Persian Empire, Alexander studied the battlefield, found one gap opening up in the Persian line, and drove his own cavalry straight through it, heading directly for the Persian king, Darius himself. Because Alexander understood something most commanders never figure out. An army's courage collapses the second its own king turns and runs. Darius ran, and the moment he did, his entire army broke apart behind him. That is what Alexander understood about fear, not just how to survive it, how to point it at somebody else and watch it tear their whole formation apart. There is another moment that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. After conquering the Persian capital, Persepolis, during a night of heavy drinking, Alexander and his soldiers set the entire palace complex on fire. Some accounts say it was calculated revenge for Persia burning Athens generations earlier. Other accounts say it was simply a drunken mob that got out of hand, and someone urged him on. Either way, one of the greatest palaces in the ancient world burned to the ground in a single reckless night, ordered by the same man capable of the most careful military planning in history. That is the nuance the hero worship version leaves out. This was not only a genius, it was also, at times, a very young man with total power, and nobody left strong enough to tell him no. What he never understood was how to sit with fear once there was no enemy left in front of him to aim it at. Years later, at a river called the Hyphasis, deep in India, his own soldiers finally stopped. These were men who had marched beside him for 8 straight years. They stopped from pure exhaustion, homesickness, and a very human limit that Alexander himself had simply never once respected. He was furious. He stormed off to his tent and refused to see anyone for 3 straight days, sulking like a child being told no for the first time in his life. On the 4th day, he finally gave the order to turn back. It was the only retreat of his entire career. The man who had conquered the largest empire on earth could not conquer his own refusal to stop. Fear he could always defeat. His own limits he never could. So let us go back to that riverbank, back to the moment we opened this video with. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, Alexander once sat listening to a philosopher named Anaxarchus, who was explaining a theory that was gaining popularity at the time. The idea that there might exist not just one world, but an infinite number of them, scattered somewhere out there. Alexander broke down in tears. His friends rushed over, confused, asking what was wrong. Alexander told them the truth. He said it was almost unbearable to think about, because if there really were infinite worlds out there, he had not even finished conquering this one single world yet. Read that again, because it might be one of the saddest sentences in ancient history. This is a man who had already done more than anyone else alive: Egypt, Persia, parts of India. And instead of feeling finished, instead of feeling proud, his first thought was simply, "There is more, and I have not got it yet." Carl Jung talked about 2 completely different directions a person's growth can take. One is outward growth. Money, status, land, applause, things other people can see and measure. The other is inward growth, becoming a more whole and settled person on the inside, whether anyone is watching or not. Alexander became an absolute master of the first kind. He never once attempted the second. Every new title he collected was really just another attempt to fill a space that could never actually be filled from the outside, because nobody had ever taught him to look at it from the inside. Pharaoh of Egypt, king of Asia, son of a god, layer after layer of armor piled on top of the exact same wound. He kept conquering the outer world, because nobody had ever taught him how to sit still inside the inner one. That is the real reason he cried that day. He never once discovered a version of enough that did not depend on how much land he controlled. History usually ends this story right there, at the most cinematic, most heartbreaking moment, and lets it stand as one giant tragedy. The more honest ending is smaller and a lot less romantic. Alexander died in Babylon at just 32 years old, most likely from a fever, made worse by years of heavy drinking that only got heavier after that retreat at the Hyphasis River. He never finished conquering India. He never made it home to Macedon. He never even named an heir. And within about 20 years of his death, the empire he had bled 3 entire continents to build had already been torn apart by his own generals. The man who could not stop moving finally stopped, and everything he built without ever once stopping to ask why fell apart almost as fast as he built it. The version of Alexander worth actually remembering is not the invincible, untouchable god king that his own propaganda invented. It is the extraordinary, unfinished, quietly frightened man underneath all of that. Someone who could defeat literally any army on the planet, and never once defeat the quiet suspicion that he still was not enough. That is the fire that carried him from a small kingdom in Macedon all the way to the edge of India. And it is the exact same fire, just smaller and quieter, that pushes so many people today from one achievement straight into the next.